Hello friends, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. Hopefully my microphone isn't picking up too much of the external noises. We're literally in the middle of a massive wind slash snow slash rainstorm and I'm sitting on the floor of my closet because this is the only quiet-ish place in the house. So anywho, this is for this week's color throwdown challenge, and for my card I'm starting off with this big Botanical heart stamp set. This came out last year? Something. I did a video on it, of course, black, gold, white. I'll link to it at the end of this video, using this set. And I decided today I wanted to white heat emboss this. So I'm stamping it onto a piece of Simon's 120 pound smooth white cardstock. And I used my anti-static powder tool. And then I inked up the stamp with clear embossing ink. And then I just tilted it back and forth in the light to make sure I had stamped everything, because there's a lot of detail on this stamp, before putting on embossing powder in case I needed to stamp it again. And then I'm coating it with Simon's white detail embossing powder. And then once that's covered, I'm going to melt this with my heat tool. Again, tilting it back and forth in the light. You can kind of see in one spot that I do catch, thankfully, that kind of remains grainy. It doesn't, just kind of disappear. And then when I see that, when I tilt it in the light, hit that with the heat tool, make sure everything's melted. And for my ink blending this time, I decided to tape my piece down to my craft mat, just using some blue painter's tape. Because I really wanted this to just remain, like the actual cardstock, to remain stationary while I do my ink blending. Usually I don't worry too much about it, I do my ink blending, I add some splatter. But since this is basically the focus of this card, I'm not doing any coloring or anything, like the ink blending is the main thing. I wanted this piece just to stay where it was so that all I had to do was concentrate on the ink blending. And for that, I'm only using one color. I'm using Blueprint Sketch Distress Oxide ink and my blending foam. And I wanted an ombre. I wouldn't bother taping this down either if I was just going to completely cover the cardstock with the ink, but I wanted it to fade from darker to lighter. So I start at the one end and then I'm pulling my ink tool like towards me. And as I'm pulling it towards me, you can see I'm not pressing the tool back into the ink pad as much, because I'm letting, the ink absorb into the cardstock, and I'm lightening my pressure so that I'm getting that bit of a fade. And then I go back in and, start again at the top, further away from me, and add more ink. And then again, just keep lightening it, softening the touch until I'm happy with it. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect because I am going to add splatter. This is just habit now. It's like my last video, I didn't do splatter, so I have to make up for it. So all I did was smush the Blueprint Sketch Oxide ink onto my little plastic watercolor palette thing. Anyway, any non-porous surface, and then just swirled it around with a wet paintbrush. I splattered that, and then I cleaned off the paintbrush, and I also just splattered clean water onto the background because oxide inks do react with water. And then I decided I wanted a little bit of a darker splatter, and I don't have Blueprint Sketch Distress paint. I'm very slowly trying to build up my collection so I have all the paints, because I really like them for splatter. Distress paints are the best, and they match. So anyway, the closest I have is Chip Sapphire, which works. It gives it a little bit of a darker splatter, which was also kind of nice. So I shook up the bottle really well and just put a couple little drops onto my palette, and same thing, just a wet paintbrush, picked it up. And then I went very light with the splatter. Like usually, I use my splat box and do all those things, but I'm going very light with this. This is a bit more controlled in a sense. I'm not just splattering the ever-living heck out of it like I normally do. I didn't want to cover, the detail of that embossed image. I just wanted that bit of splatter. So everything is dry at this point. I started to remove the tape, and then I realized I didn't want to remove this because what I'm going to do next, it will just be easier. So I actually just put the tape back in place. So just put it back in place. I wasn't worried about it, like the tape being perfect either, but this will just make everything easier. So this background is dry. The splatter is dry. And then I want to add a little bit of stenciling. I was actually inspired by there's that big stripe stamp in this set, but I didn't want to use the stamp, I wanted a bit wider stripes, plus I wanted to use my Nouveau Glacier paste. So I pulled out this diagonal stripe stencil, and I only want 3 stripes. So I'm using more of the painter's tape, and I'm just pressing like onto my hands and my arms so it's not quite as sticky. And I'm just masking off everything but these 3 stripes. And I tried to line it up straight. In the end it wasn't, but I'm going to fix that later too. And then I'm going to use some of this Green Envy Nouveau Glacier paste, which again, I've done several videos using these pastes, and I just like them because they basically kind of give a faux foiled look. So I apply it first, and then I just use my big stencil pal just to scrape off any excess. And then I always use press and seal, especially on my glacier paste, but all my pastes. Talked about this in a lot of videos. I use the press and seal. It helps keep it more sealed so that the product doesn't dry out. And then I let it completely dry. Came back to it when it was dry, then could remove the tape, and everything's good to go. And that's when I realized, once I removed the tape, that yes, those stripes were not straight. But thankfully I had done this piece larger than my A2 card front because I'd wanted to tape it down. So I had some wiggle room. So I just lined up the stenciled stripes in my paper trimmer. And then once I had those lined up, I can trim off one side, and then I use that one side as my guide to trim off everything else. And then that way I've got everything back to a straight edge. And then I'm going to trim this down to slightly smaller than an A2 card front. So I think I end up doing like 4. My go-to is kind of 4 inches by 5 1/4, since an A2 card front is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So I got all those edges trimmed off. Once I was happy with that, then I can go on and work on my sentiment, which I ended up deciding to use this big With All My Heart wafer die that Simon just released. And because it's the color challenge, I needed to get some pink onto this card. So I pulled out Picked Raspberry Distress Oxide ink. Kind of did the same thing. Did almost an ombre blend. I didn't worry about it too much because once it's die cut, it's not going to be super obvious. But I started darkest at what will be the bottom, and then just kind of blended my way up. And again, just working on Simon's smooth white cardstock. So I die cut that with the wafer die, and then I die cut 2 more layers with just white cardstock, because as is tradition, I have to stack my sentiments 3 times. Some of it's a little bit of my OCD, and some of it is just, it genuinely, to me, it just looks a lot better. The dimension you get when die cut sentiments have been stacked. I like it so much more. So stack those together with the 2 white layers on the bottom. And then I'm going to add craft tacky glue to that, and then put the pink cardstock on top. And originally I wasn't going to use the outline. This wafer die set has the words and the outline. I was going to use just the words, but when this was done and I held it over the card front, the like busyness of the card front with like the stenciled stripes and the detail of the big botanical flower, the sentiment just kind of faded into it. So I didn't want to cover up the background, obviously. So I just die cut the outline from some vellum. So it kind of helps the sentiment to stand out a little bit, but it doesn't really cover, you know, because you can see through the vellum. So I die cut that, and then I'm just going to adhere the sentiment to the vellum. Again, craft tacky glue, just little tiny dabs of it because you don't want it oozing out all over the place. So then for that part of the sentiment, it's complete. I decided I wanted to add to it so it doesn't just say like with all my heart. The thing though I like about this sentiment is I could have done like thank you, you know, you could do all kinds of things, but I decided to use just the love you words from the Botanical heart set, just this little love you stamp. So I grabbed a scrap of some green leaf cardstock, and I'm going to stamp that little sentiment with the same clear embossing ink, and then I'm going to heat emboss it with that same detail white embossing powder. So get that coated, excess tapped off. I'm going to melt that with my heat tool, and then once that's melted, I'm going to use the coordinating wafer die set. There's a couple different circles because there's all those like circle frames and everything with the stamp set. But I'm just going to use the smaller circle, and I'm going to die cut this with that circle. So then once that's done, I want to do the inside of my card. So I have my card base, which is more smooth white cardstock. And I have that Botanical heart still just sitting in my MISTI. So I lined everything up. I liked where it was, so I'm just going to ink up this stamp with that same Blueprint Sketch Distress Oxide ink. So make sure I got it all inked up, make sure it's going to cover the inside of the card. Once I'm happy with it, I'm going to stamp that onto the inside of my card. And I decided not to add like any more sentiments, anything. Once this was stamped, I was like, oh, this is such a pretty stamp. And then I was like, ooh, this would look really pretty stamped in blue like this, like for a card front. And then I had to stop myself because, you know, I could just keep going, but I'm running out of time as always. But anywho, love that. And I will use a big, like either a silver gel pen or a black gel pen or a pink gel pen would look really nice, or green, any of the colors, but just a really good, deep, wide nibbed pen to write over that on the inside of the card because it is pretty dark with the blue and the busyness. But yeah, I will just write over it and it'll be good to go. So inside of the card is done. I'm going to adhere my sentiments to the outside of the card with my craft tacky glue. Once those are adhered into place, I'm going to flip my card front over and I'm going to coat the back of this with Simon's Big Mama foam tape because I want just a little bit of dimension. So I'm going to completely cover the back of this with foam tape. Once this is completely covered, I'm going to peel off the backing, and then it depends on my mood whether or not I do this. I try to make a point of doing it more often because I'm getting bad at eyeballing it. But with foam tape, the second you press it down, it's not going anywhere. So you get like one shot to get it lined up. So to get around that, I use craft tacky glue. So I peeled off all the backing, put on, squiggle of the craft tacky glue on top of the foam tape. So that just gives me that little extra, second or two that I need to get things lined up so it's straight on the card front. And then once it's straight, press it down, it ain't going anywhere. So I've got that done. And of course I got to add a little bit of bling. You can't not have bling, like splatter and bling. Hello. So I pulled out several. Again, it's just habit. People were commenting on the last video. It's like, where's all the bling? Yeah, it's here. So I used some Studio Katia. I had some iridescent bubbles. I have iridescent tiny bubbles that are just teeny tiny. And then some, I think they're Blossom pink sparkles. They're pink crystals with like shimmer in them. And then some moss green pearls. So just a few of them. I didn't go completely overboard. Just several varieties, but not very many of them. So kind of sprinkled those throughout the card front. And then once I was kind of happy with where I had everything, I'm going to adhere these into place with dabs of my craft tacky glue. And then once those are adhered, I'm going to pair this card with a pink envelope from my stash. And this card is complete. So, as always, I will have a link below the video to my blog post. In the blog post, I will link to the Color Throwdown Challenge. Anyone can participate. All the info is on the Color Throwdown blog. I link to it in my blog post. There's tons of inspiration, all that fun stuff. And it's just a fun challenge. Like we do this for fun. So I'll link to that. And then I will also, of course, have my supply list. I'll link to all the supplies I used so you guys can check that out if you're interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting. I very much appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.